what Marxism then shares with Orthodox and especially neoclassical economics, is this fear of the printing press, right? And it sort of imagines the printing press as somehow exceptional or external to everyday monetary interactions in production, whereas I think, not the literal printing press, but I think in the MMT world, we can just say that, we're constantly so-called printing money. If we didn't, we couldn't produce and distribute and take care of one another. The printing money is not an exception. It is the rule, right? So if we let banks print money or create money endogenously every second of every day, why are we freaking out about doing it by and for the public?
This is the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley.
Hi, my name is Patricia Pino and welcome to the MMT podcast. Today we'll be speaking to Scott Ferguson, who is co-founder and co-director of the Humanities division of the Modern Money Network in the US. And his podcast, Money on the Left, stems from this project. Now, Marxism is a vast subject, and the length of this episode reflects that. And even then, we have but merely scratched the surface. We discuss some aspects of Marxist philosophy, Marxism and the economics profession, and Marxism and MMT. In this episode, we don't go over the basics of MMT so much. If you are new to MMT, I would suggest you backtrack a few episodes before you engage with what is a very politically charged subject.
Here we are with Scott Ferguson, who is this is quite a lengthy one, an associate professor of humanities and culture studies at the University of South Florida. I think I did well there.
You did.
A co-host of Money on the Left and an associate of the Modern Money Network in the United States. How are you, Scott?
I am great. Thanks for having me.
Now, we are really excited about having you here because, I personally am, because I've been looking at what has been happening, the conversations that have been happening around MMT and Marxism, and there is a lot I do understand, and there is a lot of gaps in my understanding. And I'd really like to get an idea of what's going on, first of all, because this seems like friendly fire, right? But also just try to, at the same time, convey of the importance of Marxism and why it matters. And this is kind of the political aspects of MMT as well, right? Which we don't talk too much about. But so let's start with just an introduction about how did you get involved with MMT, your background, your involvement with Modern Money Network, etc.
Okay, we'll see how long this is. I'll try to keep it shorter than longer. So I have a PhD in the humanities. My degree is in rhetoric and in film and media studies. And rhetoric is a very interdisciplinary discipline. And then I focused on visual culture and film and media studies. And I did this at UC Berkeley and finished up in about 2010. And I worked on a lot of things, some things maybe not so relevant for this discussion, but one of my specialties along the way was thinking about political economy and money and its relationship to culture, visual culture, and very often focusing on moving image culture.
So how did you jump from the humanities to the kind of more technical economic stuff? Was it an easy jump?
It was multi-stage. So what happens in much of the humanities, not all of the humanities, but much of the humanities in the United States casts to the left. And if you are interested in critically studying, analyzing, making sense of the history of culture, visual culture, whatever it is that you study, then you often spend time reading a lot of Marx, which I did. And not just Karl Marx, but a whole history of Marxism. And in fact, what I specialize in particular is a whole branch of Marxism that develops and, say, really gets going in the 20s and 30s, called critical theory. Sometimes it's dubbed Western Marxism. And the whole thing about Western Marxism or critical theory, it's really associated with this group called the Frankfurt School, is that they had a critique of Marxists for them, and the Marxists that were associated with what was called the Second International Working Men's Association. And that era of turn of the century, late 19th century, early 20th century, Second International Marxism really cast itself in a very scientific mode. And they thought themselves very precise and objective, and they like to use math. And part of what they were doing is they really wanted to focus in on what mattered. And they ran with Marx's idea of the base, right? Which is the productive forces and infrastructure of society. And then the counter term, which you might have heard of, was superstructure, right? And superstructure, kind of at its most vulgar and worst definition, is all this sort of fluff that's on top of the productive base that doesn't really matter. It's all the things that are just kind of expressions of bourgeois capitalist domination. It's very, so what counts as superstructure would be the state and law, but even more than that, culture and aesthetics and
context. Is that?
Yeah, maybe social context, maybe some of that too, but also like literature and painting and music and eventually film when film was invented in the 1890s. All that stuff is seen as kind of like passive results of the fundamental bottom and force that is the productive base and the class conflict in the relations of production that constitute that base. And what critical theorists in the Frankfurt School and fellow travelers were doing, what they were doing was saying, well, hey, wait, we're sophisticated intellectuals who are sympathetic with the working class. We are anti-bourgeois, even though we are bourgeois. And we also study aesthetics. Most of us have studied German aesthetics. We've studied Kant and Hegel and people and Schiller and people like this. And we think that the so-called superstructure isn't just meaningless fluff that you can just kind of wish away, but it's actually constitutive, right? It's part of the creation of this whole shared collective reality that is so-called capitalism.
That within Marxism, the vast area of Marxism, there is kind of tribes within them. Indeed. And there is disagreement within these tribes. Is that? Absolutely.
And I know we're kind of veering away from my bio, but that's fine. I think all this is important. I think one thing to say about the MMT Marxism debate that I've stressed in some of my own publications is that neither MMT nor Marxism are singular, homogeneous schools. There's variety in each one of these schools, and in fact, I think it's totally ahistorical, wrong, and unfair to even ultimately oppose the two schools against one another. So each one's very heterogeneous, and they're all entangled in all kinds of interesting ways, which doesn't mean that there aren't points of contention, right, on both sides coming from different parties. But I think we need to start from that complicated point of view. And yes, so I was trained, to get back to my bio and kind of a history of Marxism lesson. That's fine. I was trained in Frankfurt School critical theory, which didn't just end in the 20s, 30s, and 40s when it was invented. It was rediscovered, and it met up with and was complicated by all kinds of French philosophers and theorists, especially in the 60s, the 80s, and 90s, doing what's called structuralism and post-structuralist critique. And so it became infused with feminism and queer studies. And so I very much came up in that long evolving tradition of critical theory, which has a kind of Marxist base, but is, plastic and evolving. And even within that through line, which you could call a sort of a school, there's all kinds of fractures and divisions, and people are shaking their fists at one another, and, for all kinds of reasons. So I came up doing that. And, the idea is when we're studying painting, or we're studying music, or we're studying, one of the things I study is Hollywood blockbusters. We're interested in how do these social forms work? What kinds of meanings do they have for the population at a given time? And not just personal meanings, but collective meanings. And then how are those meanings expressive of, related to, affirming, critiquing, complicating the broader capitalist moment in which it's situated? Mm-hmm. It's hard to talk about it in broad brushstrokes. You have to kind of get into details and specifics to really see how it works. But that's the broad kind of question and pursuit, right? And this world of critical theory is critical of the status quo, wants justice for all, wants to find ways of letting collective suffering be heard when it's been squelched, and is engaging with culture and aesthetics in a way that is trying to do that. So that's where I came from. And, according to
made Marx sound a lot more interesting to me, because I happen to love culture and aesthetics, and any excuse to get it involved in.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the horrible things about mainstream economics is that it increasingly strips away those kinds of embedded contextual, cultural, aesthetic values, or if it includes them, it reduces them to individual preferences and utility maximization and all this nonsense.
Just to sidetrack a little bit, maybe we'll get back to the main point shortly. But I read a paper, an essay on aesthetics and Marx's views on art and Hegel's views on art, and there wasn't much there apparently. But they did something that did stuck in my mind about this essay was that I mentioned a comparison between work and art making, as in work being kind of that the inspiration or the motivation for work comes from pretty much the same place as to the motivation or inspiration for making art, and that basically art making is almost like the highest expression of human work.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very much in Marx, and that's probably best and most extensively expressed in an earlier work of his that's just been called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. And it's there that he doesn't have a highly worked out systemic critique of the capitalist mode of production, which comes later in his career. This is the moment that many scholars, somewhat contestedly, but many scholars have called the young humanist Marx. And in that humanist 1844 manuscripts text, he spends a lot of time talking about alienation, and not just the alienation of individuals from their labor, from the products that they produce, from the very decision-making process about how they're going to labor. But he then specifically extends this critical analysis to include the very alienation of the modern laborer's senses, their whole sensorium. So he'll talk about vision and hearing and touch and taste, and says that all these senses become dulled under monotonized work routines. And while a capitalist can presumably retire from the big evil world of economic production to some salon or some refuge, some private refuge, and enjoy beautiful oil paintings and kind of let their sensory apparatus kind of ruminate and expand in relationship to this wonderful oil painting. This is not accessible to the worker. The worker's too tired, too poor. And their aesthetic sensory capacities are squelched. And I think one of the things that motivates Marx throughout his career, even when he is doing really systemic and sometimes painfully boring analysis of systems of capitalist exploitation, is this desire to liberate and redeem the human sensorium for workers and ultimately for everybody. So you can say that that aesthetic impulse has been part of Marxism from the beginning, but it got ignored and repressed in the late 19th, early 20th century, at least in the kind of mainstream Second International Marxism. And then it was the critical theorists, largely in Germany, other places in Eastern Europe as well, that really tried to recuperate this and then pose it as a problem. They don't simply say, the capitalist machine ruins everything, and we just have to say how bad it is. They look at cultural objects, especially mass-produced cultural objects produced by what they termed the culture industry, as kind of being, they would describe them as almost like symptoms, like the symptom you go to a doctor's office. A symptom is like, it's not the disease itself, but it's a kind of expression of the disease, and it's sort of a mystery. And the doctor has been trained to read that mystery and to say, your skin is turning that color because you have a mineral deficiency, right? But there's not an immediate connection that's visible. And in many ways, that's the way that critical theory looks at paintings and music and film, and especially mass culture, is it tries to kind of diagnose what's happening with the social body and its problems and crises and suffering, and also its possibilities and potential for hope by reading culture in this kind of symptomatic way.
That has quite interesting political implications as well, around something that I found, and that I've mentioned before, but I don't think ever in the podcast, that I found with regards to the job guarantee, and with the kind of people who, the arguments that people say when people object to it, the arguments that they come up with tend to be quite dependent upon their place in the pecking order, in the sense that, and I'm referring specifically to middle classes versus working classes. And to me, that shows they have a completely different relationship with work. And you can see especially the last few decades, that work has become more and more and more exploitative. The relationship that the working classes have with work is horrific at the moment, and it's a bad one. I mean, it's inherently a bad one, but it's particularly bad in the current conditions. And so, the very notion of work, it sounds almost like torture at times. The fact that, it's almost like many of them can no longer imagine any work that does not involve, the toiling and the kind of the pain and that. Whereas when you speak to somebody who actually enjoys their employment, and most of them tend to be middle class types of employment, people who own their own small businesses, who have more autonomy, or who are more creative types, they tend to be more open to the idea. And to them, I think from their side, the argument is that they don't understand the importance of workforce at all. They just want to be more creative. But anyway, that's what I've noticed. So just going back to your bio, how did you get involved with the? Let's talk about you. Yeah. With the Modern Money Network.
Okay, so what happens is I'm going on my merry way. I get a job in Florida. I moved from California to Florida, and working in a Marxist paradigm, Marxist critical theory paradigm, and teaching it as well. I basically presumed that what money was and how money worked was that it was essentially a private exchange relationship. I probably, embarrassingly, would have said that it evolved from barter. I don't know how much I cared about that, but that
we were all there once.
Yeah, right. And that it's a punishingly finite medium. And it's essentially this kind of decentered, a marketplace, right? And in fact, what money is essentially just a kind of, it just belongs to the marketplace. It is the marketplace. It is just private finite exchanges. And then the state is kind of, this weirdly bipolar entity, which on the one hand is the most hyperpotent, violent institution in all the land, that can throw us in jail and go to war and kill and murder and etc. And on the other hand, it is the weakest entity and most impotent entity in all the land because, of course, it can barely tax enough to spend, and it can't borrow too much because that'll cause hyperinflation. And the interest.
This is a position that we associate with the right. But
absolutely, and it's built into. So this is my from the other side of the conversion, right? This is one way of putting who I used to be, or what I think. A lot of Marxism is that it's sort of like the dark, almost romantic underbelly of mainstream classical and neoclassical economics. That it doesn't actually challenge the basic assumptions; it just evaluates them differently. If classical and neoclassical economics both have different and evolving ones, but nevertheless, they both share some kind of commitment to balance or equilibrium or clearing. What Marxism says is, yes, money is this finite exchange, medium, but it doesn't balance. There is no equilibrium. It doesn't work out. What it is it's contradictory. It's exploitative. And so it tends toward crisis, and it's always plummeting into crisis, further and further crisis. And then it evolves by trying to make up for those crises. And then that new solution breeds more crises, and then more crises. And this kind of like dark picture, I think, ultimately, in many key ways, misperceives the very structures and conditions of how collective production works. in general and in the modern era. And so what happened to me is that I was listening to a podcast. And have you heard of Tom O'Brien's podcast?
No, I haven't. But is that, I imagine that's not MMT.
He has, it's heterodox Marxist, and he has MMT people on there.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
A precursor to the Money on the Left and the MMT podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the time, I didn't even really know what heterodox economics was. I basically thought there was Marxism, American neoclassical Keynesianism, which I would have just called Keynesianism at the time, and then mainstream, neoclassical. And so I was listening to that, I think in 2012 or something, and Randy Ray was on. And
okay.
And I couldn't, I've told this story before in an interview with Matt Forstetter. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I think unlike many others and other Marxists, I wanted it. It made sense, and I wanted it to make sense, and I wanted it to be persuasive, verifiable, and ultimately, I guess, true. And I was just knocked on my butt. It was really this really intense, crazy, world-changing moment for me. And the way I put it is, whereas I had long thought that money was a punishingly finite, private, necessarily exploitative relationship that required ultimately getting rid of in order to achieve any kind of justice that wasn't just piecemeal reform, what MMT provided was a whole counter vision of money and how it worked and what it was capable of, which essentially asserted that money is a public utility and a public monopoly, and that it is inexhaustible. That it comes from the government. The government cannot run out of money. Any private use of money is a politically and legally mediated use of money, and that ultimately government and law and really the public sector is responsible for all of the finite exchanges and crises that are going on, which doesn't mean, right, as we all know in the MMT world, it doesn't mean suddenly we're in a Soviet command economy, and it doesn't mean that every single decision gets commanded from the center. Yeah, not at all, right? But instead, it's a I like to think of it as a kind of broad, nested, interdependent system that you cannot extract the private from the public, and the private is actually smaller and always sits inside of the public. And so I sort of went from thinking that money was the root of universal alienation, as a good Marxist, I thought, to realizing that, while not neutral and certainly not perfect or just nice, money was the very relationship that we had to rethink and to and reclaim and kind of make serve communities and make serve the planet, and then it just changed my whole research paradigm as a scholar, let alone just being a citizen and a resident of the world and wanting good things for me and my my world, but as a researcher, I was like, wow, Western Marxism critical theory had great questions. What if I started asking those same questions, but from an MMT understanding of money, rather than from the perspective of this kind of, now I feel it's this sort of Protestant, this fall story that is told, just like, we're ruined because of money, right? And then, so now what? Instead, there's just much more,
it's more like let's harness money. Let's
Yeah. And also let's
put it under public control.
Absolutely. And let's also really point the finger at and reveal the ways in which specific historical contexts of government and governance and law are precipitating these crises, right? So, to take a term that's very, very much bandied about, nowadays, is this term secular stagnation, right? And secular stagnation, I would say, presumes so many things that are very orthodox, right? It sort of presumes that the market is trying, but it's stagnated. What possibly could we do about it? And it sort of imagines that it's sort of autonomous out there. And come on, guys, have more confidence. Have more confidence. Or hey, maybe if we lower the interest rate, maybe
it's like Peter Pan. If you believe, you will fly.
It's totally Peter Pan. And so, my response to this is that, this is the wrong framing. It's not. And why secular stagnation? It sort of imagines that, like, well, what's the opposite, like to secular, like theological. So, and that might imply, like, something bigger, like the government being responsible, right? So to me, I'm interested in saying we need, metaphorically speaking, not to approach our political, economic, cultural aesthetic lives in taking secular stagnation or secular success and belief for granted, but rather be thinking about, what you might call like the theological governmental conditions that are allowing mass unemployment, that are actively deciding not to have a job guarantee, wage and benefits floor, and quality of life floor that then sucks down the entire economy with it from the bottom to the top. And I just think that's an entirely different way of looking at not only political economy, but when you start looking at aesthetics and culture, I think it changes everything.
So why are not all Marxists as accepting, as open to new ideas as you are?
That's a complicated question. I think some are. I think, first and foremost, I think Bill Mitchell is a Marxist. He certainly seems open to MMT since he helped create it. I would say that not in any kind of dogmatic way, but it's certainly in a way that very much engages with Marx and appreciates Marx. Nathan Tankis, who's totally MMT, I think that he's got serious Marx, in his bones, as the economist Joan Robinson once said. And then you have other kind of fellow travelers like Riccardo Bellafiore in Italy. He's one of these circuitist, kind of post-Keynesian economists with a Marxist, I think a Marxist basis. Randall Wray's work on state money has been very important to him as well. So I think when we're in the midst of, throwdown matches with, Doug Henwood or Matt Brunig or Paul Mason, I think it's easy to let ourselves get carried away and everybody involved be like, yeah, this is MMT versus Marxism and they're totally separate and they've got nothing to do with one another and who's going to win, right?
So that's the wrong way to see it, basically.
I think so. And again, like I said earlier, you can still develop all kinds of critiques. And I'm probably one of the most outspoken, as certainly in terms of my writing, critics of Marxism and Marxism's construction of money. But maybe because I am so critical, I guess what I would say is that my whole approach comes from critical theory, and that's part of Marxism. And I still think what I'm doing is critical theory, and it owes something to that tradition. I don't necessarily see myself as being outside of it, even as I have things to critique about it. Another way of putting it, no, I'm not going to go there. Anyway, go ahead. You go.
Well, this is what confuses me, because my understanding is that Marxism is relevant to all economics, really. But is it fair to say that neoclassical economics ignores Marx, or is that unfair of me to say?
I think on the whole, I would say that yes, mainstream orthodox neoclassical economics, as I understand it.
And does that include new Keynesians?
Yeah. That includes new Keynesians. I would say that Marx, along with the rest of what we call heterodox economics, is dismissed as irrelevant, for sure. I think that on the other hand, you have certain Marxists who, over the years, have borrowed tools from neoclassical economics for a variety of reasons. So in a certain way, neoclassical economics has worked its way into lots of different subfields, and it even informs Marxism now in many ways itself. But yeah, in terms of, like, if we're talking about institutional politics and the top universities, the top departments, the top journals, who's let in, who's policed and put at the margins, I would say that Marxism just doesn't matter. And certainly in the United States, I don't know, it might be more complicated in the UK and Europe. My understanding is that when it comes to political discourse, I think Marxism is more legitimate, more explicit in the UK and Europe, where you have parties that, whether they are or not, call themselves socialist. You have political leaders who, will avow their Marxist training or their Marxist, leanings or allegiances. You can turn on a mainstream news program and find, a Marxist weighing in on what's going on, whether it's Slavoj Žižek or Yanis Varoufakis or Paul Mason. That doesn't happen in the United States. You'd never find somebody, like Paul Mason on CNN or even MSNBC. Now we have our own leftist media, and I think it's really exploded since the financial crisis, and certainly in the wake of Occupy Wall Street. But for the most part, I just think that Marxism and its influence is even less in the United States. And basically where Marxism thrives in the United States is historically is in, at least in the latter part of the 20th century, is in humanities departments and in,
philosophy.
Yeah. Although, to be honest, most philosophy departments they tend to do the Anglo-American philosophy departments tend to do what's called analytical philosophy, and although that's loosened up a little bit, they're more interested in kind of ahistorical logical questions and problems, rather than this sort of deeply situated political historical work that we associate Marx and others with. So yeah, I mean, people do study Marx in philosophy departments, but
I think what you were saying with regards to how socialism is a dirty word in America. It is to it is here sometimes. It's used or is intended to be used as a scare word, but it's not nowhere near as effective as a scare word here as it is in the States.
Sure.
And I think I have this theory that when people want to use terms like Marxism and socialism as a scare word, what they're really trying to do is to relate it to Stalin, like that kind of authoritarianism, central planned government, and cold war, blah blah blah. And but because I've seen interviews with people like Tony Blair talking about how he was influenced by Marx, in his youth, and nobody minded when he said that. So sometimes it is used as a weapon, and sometimes it is perfectly allowed, depending on context.
Yeah, and I do think that that's something that's there's a looser relationship in public discourse in the UK and Europe, because I'm just thinking, for Bill Clinton to have said that, oh yeah, I learned a lot from Marx is, that would have never flied,
Yeah. I've seen arguments with Matt Brunig online for quite a while.
Yeah, he also is very, just to clarify, he is extremely neoclassical. He's sort of like, he's a neoclassical socialist that I think probably would...
Does he call himself that? Because I thought that was just that kind of neoclassical Marxism thing was just kind of a joke going on.
Well, the joke is a satirical critique of his assumptions. No, I don't think he calls him. He does not call himself a neoclassical Marxist. But that Twitter account and some of the blogs that have come out of that, it's trying to bring out those assumptions that he just kind of takes for granted. He and some others as well.
But the thing that really kicked it off was Doug Henwood's article on. Yeah. There is some harsh criticism on that article in the sense that parts of it don't seem very well intentioned or in good faith. There seems to be quite some obvious and kind of purposeful misrepresentations of MMT, and some quite obvious attempts to kind of tarnish the reputation of people associated with MMT as a means to damage MMT indirectly.
Absolutely, yeah. There's
of the most obvious ones, I suppose, would be like a reference to the fact that Warren Mosler was a banker. Everybody knows he was a banker. He says he was a banker all the time. But,
yeah. Let me just say, one of my favorite people, Emma Katerine, at a certain point, I think responded to, I don't think it was Doug's quip. I think other people have made this linkage and made it this sort of scandalous revelation. And Emma on Twitter said, anybody heard of Engels, right? Like, Engels bankrolled the Marxist project. Engels came from, a wealthy capitalist family, right? That's where the money came from, and to play these like purity games is, to me, absurd. It's totally absurd.
But it does, I think it's just as much as it happens in America, that does happen over here as well. It's considered a cheap shot, kind of trying to avoid having the real argument and kind of going sideways. But anyway, I was still surprised because, this is friendly fire, and we always think the left is very united, or we hope the left. And when I started with MMT, I was like, God, we can have full employment and we can abolish poverty. Everybody's going to love this. And apparently not. Even people who I would imagine wouldn't be natural allies. Do you think this can be resolved, or can there be consensus between these two?
Well, again, I'll say that I don't know if it's always a matter of... I still don't think it's right to start with these two as stable and opposed, right? So then it becomes a question of what are the possibilities for conversation, collaboration, synthesis between what has emerged as MMT and the ongoing multiple traditions of Marxism. And I think that's a rich, open question that I think that, there's all kinds of opportunities here. And I think that my own work is part of that. I think Bella Fiore's work is part of that. More and more people through social media who are Marxists and humanities scholars that I'm friends with, sometimes by several degrees of separation, many of them are very intrigued by MMT, and they're very much part of the Marxist tradition, and they're going to do with it what they're going to do with it. And so, I think there's a lot of hope there. Then it becomes a question of, is there hope for reconciliation between those like Doug Henwood and others who have drawn a line in the sand, made an absolute opposition, and said, no way, right? And no way at all. And to that, I would say highly unlikely. And ultimately, I'm not sure it matters. Mm-hmm. What I think does matter is making sure that through, conversations like this, is opening up room for all the people who listen and read Doug Henwood to have a more complex and nuanced way of engaging across Marxism, MMT, and back again. I think that's the issue. And, I personally don't like to fight very much on social media, but I think when I am engaging, I'm never really thinking about winning an argument with the interlocutor who seems dead set on rejecting all of my premises. Instead, what I want to do is make available and as clear as possible, sometimes less clear, but when I can, as clear as possible, this alternative. And that this alternative is a complicated, rich, ongoing project that we'd love help with. And it's not just it's not just a bunch of memes, like taxes don't fund federal spending. I mean, you got to get the meme, but that's just the beginning. There's a lot more to do. So I have hope in that way, that I think there are strategies for opening up the conversation, and that we should be always seeking to prevent the reduction of the MMT Marxism relationship to the terms of any of these individual opponents, if that makes sense.
You're very good at social media, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
You put us all to shame.
Well, thanks.
But from what I read on Henwood's article, he believes there is sometimes disagreement when there actually might not be any. For example, he accuses MMT of ignoring the importance of waging class war through fiscal policy, to quote.
Yes.
They see saying taxes don't fund spending as giving permission to rich people to have as much money as they want without consequence. And that's not what MMT is saying at all. Nope. And in a way, I don't think MMT denies the balance of power between classes related, very important in fiscal policy. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, so there's a few things I would want to say to that. One is that one of the things that I find really frustrating and ultimately signals, I think, a bad faith on the part of some of our key interlocutors on Twitter and elsewhere is when, and actually Matt Brunig does this a lot, when they accuse MMT of having this horrible position on something like, you don't think about class or whatever it is, and we say, yes, we do. And they say, no, you don't. I've read a bunch of things and you don't. And then very often I'll say, okay, so let's say, it's not always front and center and maybe it should be more. Let's say that. And let's start with me or Rowan Gray or else affirming right now that we want to think MMT through power struggle and class, at least in part. What do we do now? And what they do, what the opponents do is they go, no, you don't think that, you don't think. And so what we've done is we've conceded. We're like, no, we do value that. You're dismissing us because we don't value something or we don't privilege something. Now we're telling you that we do, but because you have this kind of undescribable, ineffable desire to cleave the difference between us, you won't run with, you won't grab our hand and run forward with us, even when we've told you that we agree with you. We agree with your critique. So that's one thing. I think there's a style of argumentation that's ultimately disingenuous on their part, and it gets revealed again and again in this way. I think, on the power and class point, you can point to a number of texts, whether they're journal articles or blog posts, or books, written by Bill Mitchell and Matt Forstetter, and Pavlina Chernova and many others who, the title is something like Money and Power, or, they do talk about power. They do talk about class. So it is there, right? Something else, when we talk about the retroactively constituted canon of MMT, right? We talk about Abba Lerner and functional finance, and we talk about Wynne Godley and sectoral balances approach. And one of these main canonical staples is the Polish-American economist Michał Kalecki, right? And his famous article, the political aspects of full employment. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole thesis. The whole thesis is, look, now that we know, given funding for World War II, or the fact that we basically got to nearly full employment, now that we know that we can absolutely afford it in the US and we can afford it all around the world, this is something that we can do. Let's not just be naively technocratic or sort of neutral or, sloppily liberal about it. Let's be good Marxists about it and say, how is this a political question, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you will, and it doesn't mean that certain sectors of the so-called capitalist class and the people in government are going to permit this or going to want this. And he gives a very not only systemic but also very complex dialectical argument about what are the multiple political historical contours of this problem of the struggle for full employment, right?
What really bothers me about that paper is that many have taken that paper and said, well, this is proof that full employment is impossible.
Which is just bonkers. First of all, it's dialectical, right? Which means he talks about the impulses for it, and then he talks about the obstacles to it, and in really sort of sophisticated ways. And then he ends the paper by reaffirming the struggle for full employment. He says it's central to leftist struggle for justice. And then the final point is to say that far from being anything like a slide into fascism, full employment, publicly supported full employment, is the best resistance against the threat of fascism. And he's writing this, right caught up sort of at the end of World War II, right? When the world is being potentially overtaken by fascism. So this is another thing, people don't read, they see an essay and it kind of circulates in the way that they want it to circulate. But they don't necessarily, as we say in academia, do the reading.
And this is the difficulty. If Christian was here, he would be telling me that we're making this too political. Let's not talk politics. Let's just teach him. And so now that he's not here, I'm allowing myself and I'm being naughty. Sorry, Christian. But one of the difficulties, and I think he has a point, and this is a point that MMT academics make often, and it's an important point, that MMT is agnostic, politically agnostic, and that it doesn't matter what your ideology is. Understanding the economy is useful for anybody, and depending on where you are in the spectrum, whether left or right, you can apply your own values to it and use it to your own ends. At the same time, we get people, the Marxists effectively saying MMT is not political enough. You're not talking about class struggle enough. You're not talking about this. Maybe there is some merit, as you say, okay, maybe we don't make a fuss about it because obviously we're trying to take this other approach and then get accused of being too political. But then if not political enough, but then if you kind of go that way and say, yes, this is about class struggle, you risk as well alienating a hell of a lot of people. It's a really difficult balance to strike.
It is. And I think I like what Stephanie Kelton said in her keynote address at the last MMT conference, the second MMT conference, which was, there's not one way. There's not one way of explaining. There's not one way of engaging. There's not one way of mobilizing. And we all have our own lanes. And we've got to keep being creative and figuring out the right language for those lanes. And, I have increasingly, just in the, honestly, 6 months, been fortunate enough to be invited to talk about MMT with a variety of political groups around Tampa Bay and Florida. And, some of them bill themselves as progressives, right, which is not leftist, right? It's sort of between the kind of, milquetoast, center-left Democrats and, the Jacobin readers, right, the hard leftists. So every time I come into a sort of new environment, I adjust my language because I believe in the broader project, but I also know I need to say words that are going to, speak to their desires and their needs, and also not, raise alarms, words that they don't want to hear, right? So I don't, in the progressive circles, I don't talk about class warfare, right? Mm-hmm. And I just think this is just being strategic and nuanced in terms of one's social engagement rhetoric, but also this is part of the politics of MMT. Something else I'll say in response to this, I speak for no one but myself, and everybody can excommunicate me. But what I would say is that I understand why we have the mantra in MMT that this is agnostic, or it's neutral, or it's merely description, and then but there's one prescription, and that's the job guarantee. I understand why, and I affirm the impulse. But what I would say is that we can put this in more nuanced ways. I think that I would prefer to say that MMT is not narrowly partisan. It doesn't belong to a single political faction or sub-faction, and it's not meant to. The project of understanding money and political economy and production and distribution and labor and everything else, and law, everything else that the MMT project is doing, it is not inspired by narrow factionalism. It is meant to understand the whole, right? And to make the whole, to understand the whole in a way that I think has been obscured in the past, and hopefully to make the whole better for everybody, right? And given that, I will say that I don't think MMT is neutral, because I don't think anything is neutral. I think that everything is embedded in a social value system.
Whether consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah, exactly, right. But I think that there is a big difference between saying that MMT is political or non-neutral, and saying MMT is a highly partisan project. Right. And I think, let me put it this way. I think that for most middle class, working class, and not working underclass people, basically most people in the world, except for the 1%, I think that what MMT does is it serves all of them. It serves all of us, because it doesn't necessarily recommend a bunch of particular values or policy proposals, but instead what it does is it reveals things about the way we collectively produce and distribute and work. And it, as I think most of us understand, it radically reframes the way that our political and economic and social and cultural debates and arguments play out, right? So the whole thing about taxes not funding spending at the federal level, I'm sure it takes on its own characters in the UK and in different places all around the world. But I can say that, the psyche and the culture and even the aesthetics of a normative, whatever this means, center-left Democrat versus a kind of everyday normative center-right or more right-wing Republican, these divisions are all based on this fantasy that taxes pay for social programs, right? So the bleeding heart Democrat is like, I'm such a nice altruistic person, and I'm middle class, and I make enough, and I want to give some of my hard-earned money with my bleeding heart to these nice people who don't have any. Aren't I great? And then I sip my latte and I drink my, whatever. And then the hardened right-wing middle-class Republican is like, I barely have enough for me and my family to survive. I fought tooth and nail. I've been fired. I got a new job, and I want to keep all that I have for myself, and I don't like those people of color and those women, and I don't like they're different from me, and I certainly don't want to give any of my money to them. So I'm going to watch NASCAR and with all my other conservative white friends, whatever. These are caricatures, and of course reality is so much more complicated than that. But I think that the caricatures do get at a certain fundamental set of assumptions that both the conventional right and left, everyday people share, that if we all got on board with this other description of the economy and how it works and what's actually happening and what's actually possible, our political culture and beyond would start to change because of it. So in that way, I think it's intensely political, right? It's super political. It's just not like factionalism. It's not partisanism.
Well, the movement behind it is political. I think it's fair to say that so many people, so many activists who give their time to teaching MMT, etc., they do it to political ends. That is absolutely political.
Yeah.
And those most invested in trying to keep MMT away from the public knowledge also have very strong political aims in doing so.
They do. And to come back to Marxism, this is where things get very, very strange and uncomfortable, where there are certain Marxists who have really dug in, drawn a line, and opposed themselves to MMT, that it does seem like instead of opening up and joining or helping to complicate, right? You don't have to drink the Kool-Aid as we've mixed it. You want to add some ingredients or take out some ingredients, be my guest, and we can continue to argue. But it does seem like certain influential Marxist intellectuals feel threatened, and they feel threatened in a kind of personal, professional way. That is somehow MMT. The more MMT becomes interesting to people and motivating for people, somehow maybe they'll be left out in the cold, or their whole career was for no reason, or something like this. I mean, I don't know if that's the case, but it seems like there's a lot of anxiety behind some of this resistance, especially when it feels like it's not substantive, especially when these moments when, we say, yes, we're all for thinking about power, and they go, but no, you're not, like, okay, well, let's say we're ready now to start. No, I will not. Right.
Being back in high school sometimes.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to say that the biggest resistance that I've seen is from the right. And I say that because, as everybody knows, I'm a lefty, and I'm mostly concerned about teaching MMT and kind of within the context of the Labour Party in the UK and the left in the UK, who could use it. But at the same time, you see this, what happened in, was it Congress or was it the Senate who put that bill forward against MMT?
There's action in both. So
right.
First it was a group of Republican senators who drafted a resolution, right, non-binding. I mean, this is what the Green New Deal was, a resolution condemning MMT. Right, which is, I mean, to be perfectly honest, like just kind of great. I mean, it's like, yeah, more publicity. What's MMT? Huh? And
about it.
Yeah, and then more recently, a group of Republicans on the House Budget Committee have called for, but I haven't heard anything since this, but they've called for a hearing to make Democrats defend their dabbling in this economic heresy. And they want like a show trial.
Do you honestly think they're going to win this? I mean,
it's absurd. It's absurd. I mean, it reminds me,
shooting themselves in the foot, right?
Yes. It reminds me of that report that was put out a little while ago by the I forget the official name, but it's like the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and it was all about condemning socialism, right? Which, that word hasn't even been a threat for 25 years in America, right? At least since the end of the Cold War. So that all that stuff is kind of, very exciting, and sort of ridiculous. But it's not just the right wing that concerns me, actually. And maybe this might be the difference between the UK and the US. I'm actually really concerned about center-left neoliberals and really like the Democratic Party establishment, which
we've got, Blairites, we call them here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For us, the line is, the kind of selling out of any kind of lingering New Deal and Great Society commitments, and you can trace the line from Carter to Clinton to Barack Obama, and then Hillary Clinton, and of course, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who are the party leadership right now, are very much these, what the feminist Marxist Nancy Fraser would call progressive neoliberals, right? Or at least Nancy Fraser is. I'm sorry, not Nancy. At least Nancy Pelosi is. Too many Nancys. At least Nancy Pelosi is. It's, to me, the struggle right now is not just politically pushing the Democratic Party to the left, which I think is actually happening, but also then in terms of our economic vision to make sure, to try our best to make sure that that move to the left is accompanied by MMT and we're not taking our shackles, our austerity shackles with us as we hopefully are shimmying to the left.
Well, this is what I like, because I think in the US you're kind of going through a mirror image of what, not a mirror image, but we're traveling together through similar paths at the moment and similar struggles. Over here, obviously, Brexit is kind of overtaking everything.
Yeah.
But I see it as well with, for example, a very quick, easy example would be to say that centrists or Blairites, who tend to be very staunchly pro-EU, one of the main arguments they gave for that campaign was that austerity would be necessary after leaving the EU. Obviously, that and they used that so much. They weaponized austerity, but that relied so much on a kind of a neoclassical understanding of economics. And what happened was that they used it so much that obviously you can't then try to persuade them of MMT, because it would mean they would have to backtrack on that, and they would never do that.
That's right. And I actually, my distanced sense is that in a certain way, you have a harder time over there right now because, I don't know. I think if you're a liberal, you think in America, an American liberal, like a neoliberal Democrat, I think you think the sky is falling and it's just everything is ending. But if you're to the left of that, this is an exciting time. It hasn't been like this. I was born in 1978, and it hasn't been like this in my entire lifetime. This kind of intense political realignment and sense of new political possibilities on the left really ended in the mid 70s, give or take. It depends which struggle you're talking about. And so for me, I think, there's all kinds of nasty, violent things happening, children being separated at the border. It's not a nice time to be alive, but it's certainly a politically and historically just super exciting moment in the United States right now. It's a paradigm crisis, and Trump is a very much a symptom of that paradigm crisis in multiple ways. Mm-hmm. And if there wasn't a paradigm crisis, there wouldn't be this opening. It's gotten so bad that tacit neoliberalism just does not hold. When you have, the establishment would never say that word neoliberalism. It was it was a word used to critique the establishment, but they wouldn't call themselves anything like that. And now you have people like Noah Smith apologizing, for neoliberalism and saying, no, there's something worth salvaging about neoliberalism, whereas before he would have never called himself that.
I had put a note here to talk about Marxist theory of value. Could you explain in very brief terms what it is and why it matters, and whether there's actual disagreement within Marxism and MMT with regards to the Marxist theory of value? So
the caveat is that, of course, one cannot talk about the Marxist theory of value in like 10 minutes. It really just that's what Marxism is.
We can try.
Yeah. It's sometimes I envision, I studied it for years and still do. It's sort of like, it's like trying to make sense of and track and envision this giant Rube Goldberg machine that has all these moving parts, and all of these pieces moving together are the process of capitalist value creation. And that's really what the Marxist critique of the capitalist mode of production is about. So no, we're not even going to come close to exhausting it. Okay. Is there an opposition, or is there a division? This is just my analysis, and I'm sure that Bill Mitchell probably would have his own, and and others would have their own. I would say absolutely. I think that Marxist value theory, the Marxist theory of value and value creation, is highly problematic and has a number of assumptions that are just contrary to what we're trying to make sense of in MMT land. So I'll try to name some of them. I think first and foremost, and I already hinted at this when I said, that Marxism basically believes that money is a private, finite, decentralized relationship with the kind of state on the side, helping sometimes and not helping other times. Okay, so Marxism is interested in what it calls the capitalist mode of production. And that's first. So it's a matter of a capitalist class and a working class and the subordination of the working class to the capitalist class in working environments, and the capitalist class they themselves not really working, making workers work for them. And then the way this becomes possible is through the circuit of exchange and the circuit of commodity exchange. And it all bubbles up from that initial relationship. So the relationship between the laborer and the capitalist is one of exchange, because they are exchanging their labor time for wages, right? And then a Marxist would say, what you need for that to happen is a universally tradable exchange instrument, right? That is a mathematical instrument and serves as what's called a universal equivalent. And that's what money is. But where money comes from in that account, whether it's historically or just logically, is that Marxists won't always necessarily say it in precisely this way, but there's very often a presumption that money is a passive expression of direct capitalist exploitation of wage labor through exchange, and money is just the result of that.
Like a manifestation of
that. Now, a Marxist would say expression. They would probably say manifestation. They would probably say realization. But I would say that very often what is presumed there is a passive relationship, or if money is a medium, it's a passive medium, and the active element is the whole complicated that I haven't even really gotten into, and I've tried to avoid the kind of the specialized terminology like use value and exchange value and surplus value and relative surplus value. But the basic idea is that value is this whole complex, contradictory, exploitative, crisis-ridden mode of production through exchange, and then it just sort of realizes itself as money. Whereas what MMT does is it starts with a truly macroeconomic, political, and legal argument that money is a fiscal tax relation between the currency issuer and all the users, right? So when we think about money as a medium, we think of it as this kind of broad foundation rather than this kind of narrow capitalist labor foundation. Do we deny that there are social classes? No. Do we deny that there's exploitation? No. But we start from a very different kind of vision of where, the way I put it is like the very shape of money. Money, for me, in the MMT view, it's a broad political, legal relation that organizes social relations of production.
So it can't be reduced to exchange. Is more than that.
Yeah, and I think what Marxists will do, it's very sophisticated, Marxist theory and in all of its varieties. But I still think that there's a model of aggregating up, right? You start with the direct material relations between the exchangers, the capitalists and the laborers, and then everybody in the marketplace, and then you aggregate it all up and then try to think about how it works as a system in aggregate. Whereas I think that the MMT insights introduce a true macro, to use a fancy word, topology. Topos means like space, right? Like a whole kind of different spatial conception of what money is and how it works. And it makes money an active medium rather than just a passive expression. And then in doing so, it also makes money a much more capacious active medium that could be organized otherwise and whose crises can be responded to in really robust ways, like a federal job guarantee, rather than what the tendency is in the Marxist theory of value is that because they always use these metaphors of motion. They talk about the laws of motion. And, especially in the era of globalization, it's like whipping around the globe, and nobody can control it, and so nobody can control money. And what the hell are we going to do? But I think this is because they really don't think of money as an active, capacious governance project.
Yeah, that what you said about money being a passive element, I think that with regards to how Marxists see value, I think that makes the most sense to me. But value is a very abstract idea, isn't it? I think in MMT we say that money is how we measure value. But is it right to say that the creation, like I've heard people like Paul Mason say, that MMTers think that value is created by creating money? It's almost like saying you print value, which is
right, which is false. And I think in many ways, contrary to what Paul Mason argues, I think that among the things that Marxists and MMT economists and supporters share, I think they do it differently, but I think we share an understanding that value is a very complex mediated process, and that it is about the way that social decisions, institutions, and dynamics organize production, right? Organize material production and distribution, and that value is a function of that whole material system. And in this way, Marxists and MMT proponents are, I think, aligned in opposition to the neoclassicals, who just kind of reduce value to personal preferences, to individual utility, and it's kind of a hyper localized personal thing, and everybody kind of has their own values, and right. There's probably more to be said about all this, but yeah, of course not. And I think that this is an absurd argument, and in fact, it's funny. So I just brought Marxism and MMT together, but now I'm going to cleave them. I think that what Marxism then shares with Orthodox and especially neoclassical economics, is this fear of the printing press, right? And it sort of imagines the printing press as somehow exceptional or external to everyday monetary interactions in production, whereas I think, not the literal printing press, but I think in the MMT world, we can just say that, we're constantly so-called printing money. If we didn't, we couldn't produce and distribute and take care of one another. The printing money is not an exception. It is the rule, right? So if we let banks print money or create money endogenously, every second of every day, why are we freaking out about doing it by and for the public, right? And and then the knee-jerk reaction of Mason and other Marxists to say that, oh, well, but that's not value. They're not listening to us. We're saying we want to create money to create value, right? Whether it's like valuing, single parents, and creating public child care centers and creating social value that way, or it's valuing, research and development on green technology. I mean, we want to make value. We don't. They reduce. I think what they do is they reduce the MMT argument to essentially what's called helicopter money, right?
Yeah.
Which is so funny because Paul Mason is all about UBI, right?
Yeah.
Which is basically helicopter money. So his own argument, he just needs to look in the mirror, to be perfectly honest. He's the one who doesn't want to create value.
He's a bag of contradictions.
Yes, yeah.
But but there is then an inherently I guess that's why it's that's kind of central though to the conflict between the two groups in understanding the creation of value the way that MMT is understood. It also necessitates people to understand the role of government and the role of banks in a completely different way.
And as an active mediator of the whole thing, not just as like a night watchman on the side who's just kicking back and then every once in a while during a crisis will come and help out. No, in the US, the central bank and the Treasury are coordinating all the time. The courts are recognizing and not recognizing contracts and monetary claims every single day. This whole thing has to be understood as being primary and primarily active. I'm going to say one more thing just because the kind of Marxist devil on my shoulder is scolding me for not saying this. So at the heart of the Marxist theory of value, which I mentioned in passing, is the theory of and the critique of surplus value. I'm not going to be able to do it justice here, but the idea is that in the relationship of domination and exploitation between the capitalist and the worker, the capitalist pays the worker in wages and pays the worker less than what they can sell the fruits of their labor for. And when they sell the fruits of their labor, of course, always in aggregate, but starting from the individual located situation, when they sell the fruits of labor in the marketplace, they earn money, right? And they get a profit. But then the firm has costs, right? It has ongoing fixed costs, paying laborers, fixed costs in, equipment. It has to pay for not only maintaining equipment, but buying new equipment. I mean, it's very, very complicated. But when all of it shakes out, there's this difference, right, that the capitalist has that the worker does not. That's a kind of strange virtual social difference that isn't anything material, but it's a surplus. It's a surplus of the material value that's been created. And this, for Marxists, is the heart of the whole capitalist mode of production, the heart of the whole modern monetary economy. It creates crisis after contradiction after crisis after contradiction, and not always in the same way. And all kind, it's always discussed in a very complicated way. And while I don't think any MMT economist has ever said this, but I guess I'll go on the record as saying that what this preoccupation with what's called surplus value and critique of it, what it does is, I think that it, from an MMT point of view, it overemphasizes something in the economy, a phenomena, and then maybe an unjust phenomena, that obscures the overall causal structure. And it also naturalizes what the kind of exploitation that's happening. So there's a kind of collapse between money and the capitalist mode of production in Marxism, although they will admit that money has been used in non-capitalist modes, but then we never really hear much about that. So really money is the capitalist mode of production. And so what money is the extraction of surplus value. And so it's bad and it's terrible. Whereas the MMT point of view says, if you want to, that's not inevitable. And in fact, if you want to do something about that, then, move production to the public sector, move a lot of it to the public sector, create a very, very, very robust wage benefits floor, quality of life floor, maybe, enforce, whatever, create a lot of worker cooperatives and non-for-profits and only give licenses to for-profit businesses in certain cases for whatever reason is being mobilized. In which case, I personally think that the problem of surplus value lessens and maybe even goes away. Maybe it's not even that big of a deal.
And maybe, you never know, Chomsky used to say that you really can't imagine the sort of, perfect system that we could have. You can only really go in steps and imagine, how to fix the current problems. I've butchered it, but that's kind of the idea that he was saying. And I guess this is to give some credit to the right-wingers when they get scared about MMT and get scared about, they call it a communist plot sometimes. It's not explicitly, but it could be. I mean,
yeah, it could be. It could be.
After the...
But not a Stalinist plot, right? Not a Stalinist plot, for sure. Marxism actually has, as I've said, it's rich, it's nuanced, it's sophisticated, it has lots of influences. What worries me is when the kind of Marxist negativity and naysaying ends up becoming unintentionally apologetic for a Thatcherite, no alternative universe. I mean, it's tragic. It's insane. And yeah, that's to me the biggest danger when it comes to certain mobilizations of contemporary Marxism.
Yes, that in their kind of rejection of government, they, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they tend to adopt a free market mentality more than they dare to admit.
Well, right. And so what Paul Mason, it was amazing in his recent blog piece critiquing MMT, which in certain ways was nice because he was trying to find ways in which he, unlike Doug, I think he was framing it as friendly fire. Doug is not being friendly at all. But yeah, one of the things he says is that one of the things that Marxists share with mainstream neoclassical economists is that they believe that the production of value takes place in the private sector and essentially like that's naturally maybe as a historical social condition, but that's where it belongs. And, there are parts in Marx's complex where he does say that the state can't be productive. He sort of passingly will give up on the state as, basically the state is a center of repression, but totally impotent when it comes to producing, because it's just a passive expression of the bourgeois class that does all the producing by exploiting through the private sector. And the big challenge of MMT is to say, and he knows it, and he's defending the private sector as its critic. The big challenge of MMT is to say, no, it's all conditioned and organized by the public sector, but the public sector has been so shrunken and made invisible to us. And what we want is to reclaim that public sector and to expand it.
This is the bit that frustrates me the most about MMT's discussion with Marxists, is that here we are telling them, this power that you think bankers have and that the market has, and capital flight, that you can't control capital.
Yeah.
We're telling you, actually, you can.
Yes.
And we can do these things.
No, I don't want to.
I don't want to.
I'm taking a ride on capital flight. See ya.
Yeah, so I really hope that they come around and they stop seeing it as a threat and they start seeing the value in it, because ultimately, we share similar aims.
Absolutely. I'll say I have a friend who's very much a Marxist, and she's a humanities literary scholar, and I was telling her about a lot of the resistance from Marxists to MMT, and she said, this is really surprising to me because, Marx was always dynamic and moving and, reading new things and taking up new weapons. And, I don't know if I believe, I don't know if I agree, but I do think that there's something to what she's saying that, ultimately she thinks that if Marx knew about MMT, he would take it on. It would be another tool in his toolbox. And whether that is the case is beside the point. I think that the main thrust of that comment is to say that it's definitely something that can serve Marx's political and economic ends, and one would hope that that we can find all kinds of ways to keep this conversation going in a productive way.
Thanks, Scott. That has been fantastic. But I wanted to ask, you've written some books?
Yeah, I've written one book, just the one book so far. So the book is a work of critical theory and aesthetics from an MMT point of view. It's really that project. It's called Declarations of Dependence, Money, Aesthetics, and the Politics of Care. It's from University of Nebraska Press. It came out in the summer of 2018. It's pretty cheap. It's like $20. So check that out, but be warned, it's the opposite of easy. It is not an introduction to anything. It is what in academia we call high theory, right? So I don't remember if we were recording at this point or not, but you were talking about how when you crack open Marx, you crack open Capital, you're like, you stall out at like the second chapter because you're just like, what, right? I'm writing in that mode, right? So be warned, and hopefully I'll write another book eventually. And then I publish essays as well and blog posts and the like.
So if people want to get in touch with you and they're interested in the humanities aspect of economics, maybe they want to learn a bit more about aesthetics or know how to get involved with you on the Modern Money Network, where can they contact you, or should they get in touch with you on Twitter? They can look me up on Twitter. I'm at Videotroph or Videotroph. It's Videotroph. Basically means like video eater. And then my university email address is probably a good place to go. Especially if you're interested in like education and thinking. If you want to like plan the revolution with me, don't contact me at my Florida public address. So that's Ferguson, SFERGUSON at USF, University of South Florida.edu. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. This was fun.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, or I'm at Christ Riley, spelled ChristReilly. And Patricia is at Patricia N. Pino, spelled PATRICIANPINO. You can also email me at christriley@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.